Hi and welcome to the recently rebranded Scientists and Coaches Strength and Conditioning Podcast, the S&C podcast. Do you like that, George?
I like it.
So we did a bit of an Instagram questionnaire the other day, and a couple of questions that came up was, so what do you want to see on the podcast? And one of them was program design, and one of them was biomechanics and how it's linked to karate. With us both having martial arts backgrounds, it's quite a good one to discuss, and it also fits quite well into program design. So let's hit the first one first. So let's talk about the biomechanics of karate and more roundly martial arts. So biomechanics, martial arts, biomechanics programming, where do they link?
Yeah, so, I mean, in terms of for combat sports, and sports in general, I think one common thing you see a lot of coaches doing is they take biomechanically similar movements and just try and load them in programs. And I think, depending on how they do it, depending on the context of it, it can either be a good thing sometimes, but sometimes I feel like it's almost a bit overkill, because they're probably getting a lot of those biomechanical movements in their skills development training. So, I mean, one super common one in boxing is like weighted shadow boxing. And you see, again, like you see S&C coaches implementing that sort of stuff, holding weights in their hands and throwing punches, where I think the idea behind it is, well, if they hold weights, it might make their punches harder or faster, blah, blah. But potentially, they could risk actually creating inconsistencies in the actual skill of punching, because the weight's going to be pulling their arm down, blah, blah, and it might actually make the technique of the punch inefficient, potentially. So that's kind of my view on some biomechanical movements. But in terms of karate, I mean, that's not my expertise, really. I mean, you could probably speak a bit more.
I mean, I think you're right, though. Like, I mean, a big movement in karate would say, if we take it kinesthetically, kinematically, would be the lunge. So especially fighters, there's a lot of lunging involved in karate. But like you say, I'm a big advocate of the filling in the gaps. Pretty similar to you, really, because if you're a karate athlete and you're training 4, 5, 6 times a week, you're doing tens of thousands of lunges a month, let alone a year. So do they really need to be weighted lunges in sessions? Does there need to be things like jerks in sessions? I would say later on, in small doses, as they're peaking, maybe working on more power specific stuff. But in terms of biomechanics and your training, I think having clean movement biomechanically is a good thing. So, for example, in combat sports in general, if we're going to look at a lunge, and you think you've seen your athlete fight or whatever, and you think actually that their lunging movement isn't as clean as it could be, then by all means add lunges into your program. And I think it's a case by case, isn't it? But actually, they're gonna get that cleaned up anyway, probably through their sport specific training
stuff.
And I think, like you said, like with the whole weighted punches thing, sometimes you can go a little bit overboard. There's this old school mentality of just do lots of what they already do. So if they're a combat athlete or a karate athlete, so getting them punching and kicking lots. I mean, the classic one I've seen in karate, and whether you've seen it or with your Thai stuff, is people will literally fix an ankle weight or
throw kicks and stuff.
Or they do it with the cables. So they'll fix an ankle strap to their ankle and and throw kicks off of a cable machine. And that's okay. I mean, when I've trained in Japan and stuff, they did a lot of tube training, which is basically a resistance band tied around your foot. But I think that's more for conditioning rather than actually trying to make you quicker, stronger.
Yeah.
I get the punch, the resisted punching as a conditioning drill.
Yeah,
if you're using it as a conditioning drill, I think that's okay if you're not doing it all the time.
Yeah, and don't overkill it as well, because I think it has the potential to create issues with the technique of punching. But like you say, in terms of maybe conditioning for maybe the shoulders and things like that, it could potentially be used. But in terms of if your intent is you're trying to make their punches faster, harder, it's probably not going to be optimal for that sort of thing.
And I think going back to the question of the biomechanics, how does it link into a program? I think that's where it doesn't add up, because biomechanics are the cleanest. My understanding of a biomechanic, or if I was going to look at a biomechanic of an athlete, I'd want it to be the cleanest possible version of the technique or the biomechanic. And if you take a punch as a biomechanic, like you said, a weighted punch under stress, under fatigue, you might then make the punch might fall down, it might not be as efficient as it could be. So therefore, are you actually training true biomechanics? Or is it just a conditioning?
Yeah, is it going to be exactly biomechanically similar to a punch in the ring? Probably not.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to biomechanics, I think sometimes people get too carried away. And guys, I know I've done it before I qualified as a coach, in terms of as a fitness coach. When I did my karate stuff, I'd get in the gyms and I'd be doing lunges, I'd be doing bench press because I could do punch up. I do bench press, but never anything pulling or never anything overhead push. I mean, I struggle with that now because I'd sort of neglected it early on with overhead pushing, because you think, I'm punching in forward, I'm not punching up. But that's not the point. And I talk a lot about like to my junior athletes about creating more of an athlete and being more athletic in general, because you tend to find that the kids or like pro athletes who are very good at their sport often were good at other sports. They were just athletic in general. Yeah. And there's a crossover from, like Deontay Wilder, for example, who's a ex-world champion boxer, but he's an elite level boxer. Also was a very, very good basketball player. Yeah. They're talking about now Jake Paul, aren't they?
Yeah.
He was he a national level wrestler at school?
Yeah,
college wrestler.
Yeah.
And he's obviously gone on to become a
decent
YouTube
boxer.
But he's, I think the skills from wrestling and just being a general athlete have helped him out as a boxer. He's never going to be an elite level boxer, but just having a basic...
There's a carryover effect.
Yeah, and there's a basic level of that. But a lot of elite athletes are actually quite good at, or were quite good at other sports as kids. And I think sometimes we get too caught up in, and there are certain sports in particular that I'm not going to mention on here, but there are certain sports in particular that are very much, this is your biomechanic that you do, this is your kinematic, do that in the gym, but just put weight to it. Yeah,
I think that's what a lot of coaches think, isn't it? They just try and replicate movements they see in the sport and just load them, and which is like you said, I think there is a time and a place for those sorts of things, but I think especially when you're training people who aren't at a very elite level. So going back to combat sports, one thing you tend to find is if there's someone who's been doing their, say, striking based sport for quite a while, their speed and power have probably already been developed to a pretty decent amount through the sport, but one lagging area you tend to find is just general strength. Yeah. Just so like that might be quite a big focus for a lot of guys at an amateur level. Like I said, the skill of the sport, the actual skill-based training, might make somebody quite athletic, but there will be gaps in the training, and I think our job is to try and fill those gaps sometimes. So like you said, to just make them an overall just more athletic in general. So if they're already quite fast, they're already quite powerful, like yes, we can try and maintain and still develop those qualities, but look at the qualities that they're not so good at. So that's where fitness testing can come into play, and you can sort of get to know exactly where their strengths and weaknesses are, and then that's where you can then devise a program. And going into the program design, that's when you sort of then start designing programs to fill in those gaps, to try and bring their whole level up together, rather than just thinking, well, for striking you need to be powerful, you need to be quick, let's forget about just general strength stuff and let's just do like ballistic stuff and plyometrics. But you could potentially be missing a big chunk of their potential just through just getting a little bit generally stronger, and being a bit more robust.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think we can both say that we're not discounting biomechanics, and like I said, there is a place for that. There is a place for cleaning up movement, and it's important that a strength coach knows the biomechanics of the sport in order to build those qualities. And equally, we're not saying completely disregard the sport specific training and do something completely random. So, for example, if you've got a combat athlete, so there's always this talk, isn't there? There's this old school thing around running. Should a combat athlete run for miles? And there's lots of studies that say yes, there's lots of studies that say no, but really we're still training them as combat athletes, so we're not completely disregarding biomechanics of it. We're not going to go, right, you guys, you need to run, so therefore we're going to start training you like marathon runners. Yeah. That's not the point. That's not what we're getting at with the biomechanics stuff, but biomechanics is important, but I would just say, in terms of the question that was asked, biomechanics linking with karate, which was the question, but more just inclusively or exclusively linking it with sports in general, so linking biomechanics with your sport, is don't overdo it with purely specific movement, because sport creates imbalances anyway.
Yeah.
Take karate for an example. If you're a fighter, you're probably going to be either orthodox or southpaw. You might be able to switch up both, but you're not switching up both 50% to 50%. So there's going to be an imbalance somewhere. Either, if you're orthodox, there's going to be an imbalance slightly probably on your left to your right. There's probably going to be over-rotation on your right, not so much on your left. And I think that's where understanding biomechanics will help, because we'll do a lot more rotation to correct the under-rotation on the left, for example, than on the right. So understanding biomechanics that way, but sometimes understanding biomechanics in the sense that biomechanically they might not be in the best place because of adaptation through sport. So for example, a right-footed footballer might have a really strong right leg in terms of movement because they're putting their right leg through the ball all the time. But their left leg is probably quite strong in static positions because they spend a lot of time on one leg when you break it down like that. So biomechanically, I think it's important to know what's happening, but I think, don't get carried away too much with just training millions of lunges or millions of punches. Like, again, like I said, the weighted punches, like the landmine punch is a great one, isn't it, for a combat athlete? Like, it's a great one to do later on in the program, building, like you say, ballistic power, building speed, building energy transfer, but do you want to be doing it on day one?
Yes, exactly. Like, and another thing with biomechanics is when you take an athlete for any sport, you kind of look at the sport and you're going to look at the biomechanics of the sport, and movements they do a lot. And it's not just so that you can load those movements, it's also so that you can build robustness and conditioning so that they're able to tolerate those movements at high volumes. So if they're doing those movements a lot, if they're throwing a lot of punches, if they're throwing a lot of kicks, if they're throwing a lot of knees, elbows, whatever it is, you want to condition all the musculature around those joints with just general strength exercises. Nothing, doesn't need to be anything fancy, just so that they're able to tolerate doing those things at high volume. So if they're throwing a lot of punches, make sure their shoulders are pretty conditioned. Make sure their elbows are conditioned. If they're throwing a lot of kicks, hips, quads, glutes, blah, blah, blah. It's just like conditioning everything around the joints that are probably going to be moving a lot. So it's very, I think it can be, especially nowadays, things are sometimes overcomplicated and they're made to look like you have to be doing these like fancy, I don't know, like banded, cable, Bosu ball, balance, like weighted overhead presses and all this sort of stuff, and it's all a bit crazy, where really, like, if you just break it down, it's like, well, they punch a lot, so it's probably a good idea if their shoulders are pretty conditioned, just so that they can keep punching a lot, because you don't want to risk injury, especially if you're their coach or a strength and conditioning coach. Like, the last thing you really want is them getting injured through the sport they're doing. You want to make sure they're capable and conditioned and robust enough to be able to do the sport. And there's a guy, I forget his last name, Jeffrey something, he wrote a book, his Instagram's GC Performance Training, and he's got a really good idea. I quite like it. He does what he calls robustness circuits. Yeah. So it's pretty much common injury sites of the sport, and he basically just puts these certain specific exercises for, say, neck strengthening, shoulder conditioning, shin conditioning, calf conditioning, blah, 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 all this sort of stuff. And he'll just put it in a circuit, and it will literally only be these like auxiliary exercises which are designed to like build robustness for that sport specifically. And I thought that was quite a smart idea. Yeah,
I know the athlete that asked this question in particular is a kata athlete for karate, so forms. And part of those forms is there's a lot of turning, there's a lot of hip motion, there's a lot of knee torque in those movements. And again, like you said, building robustness. If I had this particular athlete, I wouldn't be looking at biomechanics at all. I'd be looking at, right, he does a lot of turning, there's a lot of hip stress, there's a lot of knee stress, there's a lot of knee torque. And I'd be putting a lot of robustness around the knees and the hips and the lower body joints and the ankle, because what I'm not going to get him to do is go, he does a 360 spin here, let's stick a barbell on him and a weight vest.
Yeah, and do a 360 spin. Yeah.
That is irrelevant, and it's not going to work, and you're not going to gain anything from that. You're probably just going to hurt yourself.
Yeah.
Whereas developing power, more ballistic work, and with that kind of stuff as well, it's very much A to B, single movements, bang, bang, quick as you can. Yeah. So I'd be working on more like ballistic power, that kind of thing from there, rather than looking at, say, I don't know, like say twisting around the knee rather than loading them up, doing a banded, resisted Bosu spin.
Something stupid,
crazy. So that's what I'd be looking at doing, and like I say, just building a bit of robustness rather than doing crazy
overkill.
Rather than kind of doing crazy biomechanics training, if you want to call it that in inverted commas. I don't actually believe that is a thing. So then moving on to program design. And so we've talked a little bit about how we program design. So talk to me a little bit about how you go about building your program. So you've got athlete in day one, they've done their consultation, you've been through what they want from you. How does George build a program?
Yeah. So first thing I like to do is usually just go through like a basic movement screen, just to sort of see what they're capable of, really, just how they move, any like restrictions or asymmetry side to side, and just try and get a holistic or overview of how they move in general. And I might even expose them to a little bit of load, just like real easy stuff, nothing too challenging, just to see how everything reacts to a little bit of load. So I might do that as well. And then what I'll then do from there is we'll go, depending on the athlete and how much time they've got between events and stuff. Let's say we've got a load of time, I'd probably do some like basic fitness tests, and then again just get an idea of general strength levels. Say like jump height scores, things like that, and then from there, once I've got all this data, I'll kind of, if I can, I'll try and compare it to some normative data as well, to sort of see where they lie up against somebody in the same sport, blah blah. And then I'll devise a program, again going back to where the gaps are. I can look at that comparison against the other data and see, well, where are they struggling? Where can we maybe pick up some of the slack? And like I said, I've found that strength tends to be one for combat athletes. I think because they're getting a lot of the power and speed training in the sport itself, that tends to be like pretty okay. Yeah. But definitely the strength tends to be one. Just general strength levels tends to be one for combat athletes. So I've seen so far. So that might be the areas that we'll probably focus on, but I wouldn't neglect the other stuff. I'd maybe just like you want to try and stimulate it a little bit, because you don't want it to, then you don't want them to lose any of that speed or power. So you might stimulate it a little bit with a few bits, but then I'll just kind of go from there, really. Yeah. And I'll just try and fill in those gaps, and again those like robustness exercises as well. Common injury sites might be another thing I'll look into for the sport, whether it's hockey, so hamstring injury, say, might do some hamstring isometrics, blah, 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 and then build robustness around certain common injury sites, like I said, the shoulders maybe for combat sports, blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
I think it's similar for me, really, but I kind of go, so I did my fitness testing first, and I think for me, my first port of call, there's a lot around normative data, isn't there, in the S&C world, and like comparing things with normative data, but for me, the first thing I look at is common injury sites. So for me, it's all about building robustness, because my philosophy is my athlete will get better at their sport by playing more of their sport.
100%, yeah.
So by doing more sport-specific stuff, I think, and you shared a really good Instagram post the other day, actually.
I know, I was then about to mention that.
Which was the...
skills coaches underestimate the use of strength and conditioning, and strength and conditioning coaches overestimate the transfer to sport. Totally agree.
And I've had this conversation with you before, haven't I? When S&C coaches call themselves performance coaches, and I disagree with that term, because we're not performance coaches. We're strength and conditioning coaches. The clue's in the name. And for me, it's about getting that athlete out as much as I can on the training pitch, in the swimming pool, whatever it is they're doing. So if they're a tennis player, getting them out on court as much as possible. And to do that, they've got to be fit enough to do that.
Yeah, to do the sport.
If they're a combat athlete, they need to get into the gym as often as possible. If they're injured, they can't train.
Yeah.
Rugby players have got to get out on the pitch. If they're not getting out on the pitch, they're not getting better at their sport. They can't develop. And if they're injured, they fall behind. They fall behind everyone else, because then they've got to go through the whole rehab work just to get back to a level of fitness before even thinking about developing the skill. Yeah. So for me, I look at injury sites first and go, right, where's the common injury sites? Where's my athlete probably going to get injured? If something freak happens you can't do that. I mean, I had a rugby player injured himself playing football at school. Like broke his ankle. I mean, you can't be away from that kind of stuff. But I had a tennis player who broke a finger playing rounders. Like you can't be away from that.
You can't mitigate the risk of everything, can you? That's the thing. But our job is to try and mitigate the risk of as much as we can control, really, isn't it? It's all about how much can we, like you say, mitigate the risk of injury in the sport itself. But outside of that, if other things happen, you can't really, you can't control those factors. But it's trying to mitigate the risk of the factors that you can control, isn't it, really? And I think that's the key thing. Like you say, if they're injured, they can't play the sport, then they're not going to get any better at the sport. And I think that is definitely a big misconception is, like we said with the post I shared, I think strength and conditioning coaches rely too much on the transfer to the sport, and they don't enforce them playing their sport more. Like you say, you want them to train as much as possible, and the only way they're going to do that is if they're fit and conditioned enough to do those things. So our job is to make sure that they are fit and conditioned enough to do the sport.
And for me as well, so I have a monitoring form with my athletes. So if I've got a hard session plan, for example, say it's a high volume session, I'll drop it down if I know they're absolutely shattered. Because for me, it's not about, I'm not going to go, they're week 8 into their program, this is the point where they should be absolutely peaking on their power. Because if they've come in and they've done 6 hours worth of swimming in the 3 days before, there's no way they can do that. So to me, it's about understanding the role and what it is. But once I've then got my athlete to a point in my program where I think, you know what, they're pretty robust now, they're pretty solid, I then go through the normative data. Right, okay, now let's do some fitness testing, sport-specific fitness testing. Where are they at in terms of their fitness levels and their performance levels and then we can start to work on performance. But I think for me, it's always been about injury and robustness first. Get them playing their sport as often as possible, as often as they're allowed, because if they're not playing their sport through injury, we've failed, I think. Like I say, sometimes you can't mitigate all this, but if someone's like pulled a shoulder playing tennis,
things happens at the end of the day, don't they? And it's then our job. Well, what can we do now with this injury? Like, is there any rehabilitation stuff we can do, or is there things where we can train around injury? Like, is there anything we can do even with this?
But also, one of my favourite quotes was "Injury is opportunity." So I've done a little injury podcast before. If you guys want to go listen to it, go sort of. I did a layman's version of injury training, but the amount of times I've had people go, I've hurt my hand, I can't train. Well, you can do legs, you can do the other hand, you can do the other arm, you can do cardio work. There's all this kind of stuff, like a tennis player, so she broke her finger, so she couldn't play tennis because she couldn't hold a racket. It gave us 6 to 8 weeks of really solid, high-level strength training, because that's the sort of thing that we couldn't do during the season because she'd be too fatigued because she's playing most weekends and she trains with me on a Thursday. So what we can't leave her is aching on a Saturday. But when she wasn't playing tennis, we could really then pump out some good level, high quality strength work because it didn't matter so much if she wasn't
interfering with any tennis training because she wasn't doing it.
She wasn't doing any tennis training. So that there is an opportunity that creates, I think, with and you have to factor that in a little bit, don't you, with your programming. But I think for me, program design is very individual, and no one's ever wrong. But I think we mentioned this on a previous podcast before. Like, athletes should question the coach if there's something in the design of the program that you're not sure about. Speak to the coach.
Ask them.
There's always a rationale of why a coach, where there should be.
Yeah, I was going to say there should always be.
As to why you're doing something, even if it's down to an individual exercise, there's always a rationale as to why you're doing this exercise. Like you said before with your hockey athletes, injuries, common injuries like with hamstrings, so you do hamstring ISOs and that kind of thing. So there's always a reason as to why you're doing something. But yeah, I think for me, program design is about what does the athlete want, first of all. So we go from there. Then what does the athlete need, and then actually what does the human need? Because we're still dealing with a human being.
Yeah, still a person at the end of the day.
And if they're not performing, as in they're injured, or they're not performing at a level because they're tired or fatigued or whatever it's going to be, there's a human at the end of that. Who's having to deal with issues. And I think that's the other thing as well. As a coach, this is where I think the scientist and the coach come in, because for me, I look at the person and go, if they're having a really hard time, say personally, who am I as a strength and conditioning coach to tell them that they've got to go beast out the hardest session they've ever done in their life, even if that was what was planned. Who am I to say that they've got to do that? Some people want to do that. Some people go through a rough time personally and go, do you know what, I just need to get in the gym, I need to go throw a few weights around.
Yeah.
Some people just crumble. And actually I think that's where I think we have to remember what the athlete wants, what the athlete needs, what does the human being want, and what does the human being need in terms of just general health. Yeah. Because I've been there before, I've been pushed too hard in a session, and you come out of there injured or hurt, and you think, actually, that was a tough session, and the coach looked at it and went, right, I'm just going to kill everyone in this session, and I'm going to beast everyone in this session. But the human in that, i.e. me, came out hurt. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
I've had that a few times where like during the warm up I'll just like be general chit chat, asking how much I've trained this week, blah blah. And literally a few weeks or a couple of weeks ago, one of my guys were like, yeah, like they'd literally been doing their sports training for like pretty much every day for almost like 2 weeks straight. I was like, bloody hell. Yeah. So I was like, just get on the jump mat, and we done some jump testing. And he said he didn't feel fatigued or anything, but I thought, I'll just check. So I just wanted to look at his jump height, and to be honest, he seemed to obviously recover from the training okay. But it's good just to check sometimes and ask him, do you feel fatigued? Because I have had times where people are like, yeah, I do feel really tired. And you sort of might have to just auto-regulate a little bit and just back down whatever you had that day, reduce the volume, reduce the intensity, whatever it might be. And just back everything off a little bit, just so, like you say, our goal at the end of the day, or our job, is to try and mitigate the risk of injury, and that's one way we can do that, is just reduce the training load of the session if you think it's necessary. And a lot of the time with a lot of guys who, especially individual sports, you tend to find it, those guys push themselves to the absolute extremes, don't they? Yeah. So it's definitely it's important for us to realise that, and to just, let's say, check on them as a human being as well. And regulate the session if you feel like you might need to.
I mean, I had a general population client, so not an athlete, but they were coming in, and they've been coming for a long time to regular sessions. Like I said, general pop, but been coming a long time, and have really progressed over the last 4 or 5 years. They come in, and I knew their dad was in hospital with not long left. And they were coming into the gym literally after leaving the hospital with their dad. So they'd been going backwards, forwards, taking people to go and see their dad in hospital. And then obviously dad ended up passing away, but they were still coming to sessions regularly. And it was about managing that, not just from a load perspective, because they weren't in any fit state to be doing anything kind of heavy or hardcore. But it was more about they wanted to be here just a bit of normality, in a fresh environment, or a familiar environment, but that wasn't a hospital.
Try and take the mind off things. And escape, isn't it?
And I think that's where we've got to look at that as well. And I think for like coaches, I think sometimes we have to be a little bit more, like you said, don't overestimate the importance. Don't overestimate your importance as a coach. And I think sometimes you have to look at the human as well. Like you said, your guy come in the other day and was like, oh, I've been doing my sport-specific training for 2 weeks straight. Your instinct was to go, whoa, hang on a minute, let's just
that's a lot. Literally.
Because the last thing you want them to do is come out here being injured.
Yeah, exactly.
And we don't want to be the straw that breaks the camel's back, right? So I think in terms of program design, it's just being aware of, actually have these little caveats, and even if they're not written down, have a caveat in your program. Actually, you're dealing with a human being, and also you're dealing with very competitive people. Do you know the story about England cricket and football? So they were playing football in their warm-up, and they still did play football in the warm-up, but at one point they took out football. They used to do football as like a warm-up game. Yep. But they're elite level cricketers. They're competitive. And they used to stick 10 England cricketers in a 5-a-side game.
Got pretty competitive.
It got pretty competitive, and you were getting people getting injured. Breaking ankles, they're going in for slide tackles on cricket pitches, and naturally cricket pitches are fairly hard because they have to be dried out and stuff. So you've got 10 elite athletes competing in a game of what is supposed to be a warm up or
a fun game.
And actually it gets crazy. Yeah. And I think as a coach we've got to be aware of that as well. That if you're setting a lift to someone, a squat, right, we're going to hit your PB tonight. That's sometimes a red rag, isn't it, to an athlete, because they're like, right, okay, and they'll do anything, and they won't tell you. Yeah. that they've hurt themselves or they're having a bit of a rough time, they'll just try and smash that PB, but they may smash themselves in the program. And so I think sometimes you have to just be a little bit careful with that in your program design. But like you say, have your normative data there, have everything else, to have your performance-based stuff there, because that's important. That's why they come into your coaches. But yeah, I think for me it's just caveat a little bit in your program.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. So we'll leave it there. We've got some more podcast planned coming up. There'll be some reactions to some elite level training as well. So that'll be on the agenda for the next couple of weeks. Thanks for listening, guys, and see you.